It started in silence. No one was watching. No one was cheering. There were no eyes on you, no likes, no claps, no messages asking how it was going. You were just there, in a room that felt too big for your dreams. The world outside kept moving while you sat in that small corner of your life, building something no one else could see. Every day felt the same. Wake up, try, fail, repeat, and still, no one noticed. It's not that they didn't care. It's that you weren't worth their attention yet. You didn't have the numbers. You didn't have the proof. You were just an idea, a risk, a long shot, and most people don't invest in that. You kept telling yourself it would work, not because you were sure, but because there was nothing else to hold on to. The doubt was loud, the loneliness louder. You weren't surrounded by motivation or inspiration. You were surrounded by bills, pressure, and silence. There were nights you couldn't sleep because your thoughts were too heavy. Mornings you didn't want to wake up because the effort felt useless. You had to force yourself to move, not because you had the energy, but because the other option was giving up, and that wasn't acceptable. No one was there to push you. You were your own motivation. You were your own coach, your own critic, your own audience. You created while fighting the urge to quit. You uploaded content that barely got noticed. You made plans that no one believed in. You posted, deleted, tried again. You researched for hours, studied what others did, wrote goals in notebooks that stayed closed for weeks. But you never stopped, even when it felt pointless, even when it felt like shouting into a void. People saw you online and thought you were fine, that you had it together. But they didn't see what it took just to make it through the day. They didn't see the meals you skipped, the sleep you lost, the anxiety you carried. You had to smile when you were crumbling. You had to keep pushing when nothing was moving. The grind wasn't pretty. It wasn't aesthetic. It was messy, raw, and painfully quiet. You had friends, but not the kind that checked in. Family, but not the kind that understood. You stopped talking about your goals because the silence after you shared them hurt more than the failure itself. You knew the look, that slight smirk, that forced nod. They didn't believe in you, not really. And you started pulling away, not out of pride, out of self-preservation. You couldn't afford to share your dream with people who couldn't even offer a little belief. So you worked, quietly. You built in small moments, in stolen hours before work, in weekends spent alone while others went out. You created drafts that no one read, shot videos no one watched, wrote scripts that sat unpublished, and still you pushed. Not because it was fun, but because it meant something. Because something inside you refused to quit, even when everything around you said you should. There were days you questioned everything. Why it was taking so long. Why no one saw your effort. Why people with less skill seemed to have more success. You tried not to compare, but it was hard not to. You tried to stay focused, but the silence got heavy. You tried to stay positive, but sometimes it felt like the world was ignoring you on purpose, like your grind was invisible, like your pain didn't count. But every time you thought about quitting, something stopped you. A voice, a memory, a small glimpse of what it could look like if you made it. That hope wasn't loud, but it was strong, and it kept you in the game. You became obsessed with progress, even if it was slow, even if no one else saw it. You tracked the tiniest wins. One more subscriber, one more comment, one more hour of work. You clung to those moments like more lifelines. You learned to celebrate in private, to clap for yourself in a room that never echoed. You started falling in love with the process, not because it was easy, but because it was yours. You knew what it cost, every piece of it, the struggle, the discipline, the rejection, the sacrifice. No one had to tell you how far you'd come. You knew, you lived it. And the craziest part, you didn't even want validation anymore. You just wanted the results. You just wanted to prove to yourself that all the silence meant something, that all the lonely nights weren't wasted, that everything you gave up wasn't in vain. You wanted to look back one day and say, I did that, not with help, not with luck, but with grind, real grind, the kind that no one claps for, the kind that builds character before it builds fame. So you kept going, kept building, kept posting, writing, failing, learning. You didn't need a crowd. You didn't need noise. You just needed belief. And even if it was quiet, even if no one else saw it, you believed enough to keep going. Because in that silence, in that grind no one saw, something powerful was growing, something real, something they would all follow one day, even if they never helped it rise. You didn't ask them for money. You didn't beg for attention. You only wanted support, someone to say, keep going, you've got this. But the messages were seen and ignored, left unread. They knew you were trying, knew you were building something from nothing, and still they said nothing. That silence cut deeper than hate ever could, because hate at least acknowledges your presence. But their silence, it made you feel invisible. You sent them links, videos, ideas, hopes. They clicked once and forgot. Some didn't even bother. You watched them repost celebrities, praise influencers they'd never meet. But not one word for you, not one share, not even a fake, I'll check it out. You were starting something real, but it wasn't trending, so they moved on. And you started realizing that most people only believe in you once others do first. They treated your dream like a phase, a hobby, something you'd grow out of. You could hear it in their tone, that sarcastic edge when they asked, so how's your little project going? You smiled. You always smiled. But inside, it chipped away at your belief, because it wasn't little to you. It was everything. It was the only thing keeping you sane, the only thing keeping you from giving up. And they dismissed it like it didn't matter. You started noticing who clapped when the room was full, and who went silent when no one else was watching. It hurt, because some of them were family, some were friends you grew up with, people you'd drop everything for. But when it came to your vision, they looked the other way. They weren't cruel. They were worse. They were indifferent. You weren't looking for validation, just presence. Someone to be there during the hard parts, to check in, to ask how it's going, to offer a word of encouragement when your doubts were screaming. But you quickly learned that most people don't show up until there's something in it for them, until your wins benefit their image, until your name starts carrying weight. They said nothing when you needed them most, but they were watching, always watching. You saw their names in your story views, saw them lurking, quietly observing your progress without saying a word. You weren't angry at first, just confused, wondering why people you love would rather be silent witnesses than active supporters. Why strangers gave you more encouragement than the ones you grew with. You questioned yourself, thought maybe you weren't good enough, maybe your content wasn't polished, maybe you were reaching too high. You sat in that doubt, let it wash over you, let it bury you for a while. And then something shifted. You realized it wasn't about you. It was about them. Their silence was never about your worth. It was about their fear, their ego, their inability to clap for someone doing what they couldn't. Some of them saw your ambition as a threat, not because you were doing anything to them, but because your effort reminded them of their own inaction. Your discipline made their excuses louder. Your consistency made them uncomfortable. So instead of supporting you, they avoided you, not out of hate, but out of insecurity. You still tried. You still showed up for their events, liked their posts, celebrated their wins, because that's who you are. You give without expecting. But it became exhausting, pouring into people who never poured back, investing your energy into connections that only existed when it was convenient for them. You started pulling back, not out of bitterness, but survival. There were nights when you questioned everything, wondered if you were wasting your time, if you were just shouting into the void. But somehow, you kept going. You kept creating, kept building, kept posting, even when it felt pointless, even when the numbers were low, because the dream wasn't about applause, it was about purpose. And somewhere in the silence, you found your reason. The rejection didn't just hurt, it transformed you. You stopped seeking approval, stopped asking for feedback, stopped begging people to care. You started building for yourself, creating from your truth, not for validation, but for expression. And that shift, that changed everything. You became your own fan, your own motivator. You clapped for yourself, cheered in your own silence, celebrated small wins without an audience. And the funny thing, that's when people started noticing. When you stopped needing them, they started watching harder. When you stopped reaching out, they started reaching in. Not because they believed, but because now they were curious. Because now it looked real. But by then, you didn't need their belief anymore. You had your own. You no longer waited for them to care. You didn't get angry when they reposted your success after ignoring your grind. You understood the game now. People love results. They hate effort. They'll ignore your grind, but flock to your glow. That's just how it is. So you stopped explaining, stopped overthinking. You just worked, in silence, in shadows, with pain in your chest and a fire in your gut. And every no became a step closer to yes. Every ignored message became a reminder that you're doing this for something bigger than likes or approval. You're doing this because you refuse to quit. Now they follow. Now they act proud. But you remember, not with anger, with clarity, because their silence was never a loss. It was fuel. It built the version of you who doesn't flinch anymore, who doesn't beg anymore, who rises without needing to be lifted. There were days when you didn't know what you were doing. You just knew you had to do something. You weren't chasing perfection. You were chasing survival, chasing purpose. There were no step-by-step guides, no one offering help. You had an idea and a heartbeat, and somehow that had to be enough. You weren't surrounded by support. You were surrounded by silence, the kind that echoes when you fail and no one notices, or worse, when they do notice and still say nothing. You learned to keep your wins to yourself because even your small victories were met with indifference. You celebrated milestones alone, in your room, at night, with no applause. You'd refresh your notifications hoping for validation, but it never came. You started wondering if anyone actually cared. You posted content that felt like your soul, and it got ignored. You poured your heart into ideas and they got skipped. You weren't trendy. You weren't viral. You were building something raw, something personal, and people weren't ready for it. You failed in silence. The kind of failure that breaks something in you, but you keep going anyway. Because stopping wasn't an option. Because there was no plan B. You cried over results that didn't match your effort. You questioned if you were even good enough. You wanted to quit more than once, but something in you refused to. Not because you had confidence, but because you had nowhere else to go. You had to make it work. You kept showing up, tired, frustrated, burnt out, but consistent. That's what they never saw. The nights where your chest felt tight from anxiety. The edits you redid 10 times. The scripts you trashed because they didn't feel honest enough. The posts you scheduled even though your mind was breaking. You were in survival mode, not grind mode. It wasn't for likes or fame. It was so you wouldn't disappear inside your own silence. There were no mentors, no calls from friends saying, "Keep going." No one stayed up with you while you figured it out. You were surrounded by people who claimed to care, but they never showed it. They were always too busy or too indifferent. They watched from a distance, only interested in outcomes, not process, not pain. They'd check in only when things started looking good. But when you were buried in self-doubt, they vanished. You used what you had: broken tools, old devices, glitches, delays. You learned to make it work. You filmed with bad lighting. You recorded with a cracked mic. You edited videos on outdated software. Every piece of progress was stitched together with grit. It was never clean, never perfect, but it was real. You didn't have a content team. You were the team. You wore every hat: creator, editor, strategist, marketer, therapist. You didn't talk about the rejections. You didn't complain, but you felt it. Every ignored message, every time someone promised to help and disappeared. You learned the hard way that most people only show up when they can benefit. Until then, they pretend not to see you. You learned that some people would rather watch you struggle than lift a finger, because your struggle makes them feel superior. Because if you succeed, it challenges their comfort. There were months where the numbers didn't move, and it messed with your head. You questioned if the algorithm was against you, if maybe your voice just didn't matter. But you still kept uploading, still kept writing, still kept pushing, because you knew that silence doesn't mean you're wrong. It just means you're early, and early is a lonely place. Some days, you created just to stay sane, just to feel like you were doing something right in a world that constantly told you otherwise. You weren't chasing validation anymore. You were chasing proof that you could do this, that you could build something out of nothing, that you could keep moving even while bleeding. And you did. With cracked knuckles and sleepless eyes, you moved, and they watched. They always watched, not to support, but to see if you'd stop, if you'd fail. They never said it, but you felt it. You felt the quiet judgment in every ignored message, every unsubtle eye roll, every time they laughed when you talked about your goals. But you kept going, not for them, not even for revenge, but because you knew there was something inside you that they'd never understand. You showed up for yourself when no one else did. You became the one cheering, planning, creating. You sacrificed weekends, friends, peace. You turned pain into content, doubt into drive, and each time you fell, you got up a little stronger, a little colder, a little more focused. You built with broken hand, not because you wanted to, but because no one offered to help you build whole. The process wasn't pretty. There was no magic moment, no sudden breakthrough, just work, quiet, unnoticed work, the kind that tests your character when nothing seems to be working. But you stayed in it, through burnout, through loneliness, through failure, and that's what built you. Not the support, not the spotlight, but the struggle, the repetition, the pain. You made something out of scraps, and now they act surprised that it's working. Now they pretend they always believe, but you know better. You remember every single silent night, every ignored plea, every small win that no one acknowledged, and you carry it, not as hate, but as memory, the canine that fuels you, the kind that whispers when you think about stopping. You didn't rise because they helped. You rose because you had no other choice. There was a time when silence felt like failure, when the absence of support felt like proof that maybe you weren't good enough. No one was clapping, no one was watching, but you kept showing up, day after day, hour after hour. You sat with your ideas when no one else cared to listen. You stayed up long after the world went quiet, and in that silence you met the only person who would never leave you, yourself. You started talking to yourself, not because you were crazy, but because there was no one else who understood. You needed someone to say, "Keep going." You needed someone to believe, and when the world didn't offer it, you gave it to yourself. You whispered affirmations in the dark. You wrote words on mirrors. You hyped yourself up before every risk, every post, every painful moment. It felt weird at first, unnatural, but then it became necessary. There's something powerful in becoming your own team. When you stop outsourcing validation, when you stop needing people to clap for you before you move, you became your own source. You stopped waiting for encouragement to act. You created in silence. You built while no one believed. You praised yourself after tiny wins. You showed up even when no one else did. You weren't just alone. You were self-sufficient. And yes, it was lonely. That part is real. There were nights you stared at your screen, doubting everything. Nights when you questioned whether any of this was worth it. No likes, no comments, no shares. Just effort. Just silence. Just you. And the grind that no one else could see. People weren't there when you were learning to edit, failing at scripting, trying to get one decent shot. They weren't there when your ideas fell flat, when you wanted to quit, when you cried over content that no one would ever notice. But you stayed. You stayed because something inside you believed. Not fully, not confidently, but enough. Enough to keep going, enough to keep moving. That whisper of belief became louder than their silence. You trained yourself to stop craving applause. You started measuring growth by your own progress, not their reaction. You knew the numbers would come, but more importantly, you knew you would come through for yourself. The human brain can't function without feedback. We're wired to seek connection, so not having that, especially when you're giving your all, hurts. But that pain taught you strength. That void forced you to fill it with your own voice. You started clapping for yourself. You learned how to motivate yourself on the days when nothing was working. You built momentum out of thin air. You didn't just work. You transformed, bit by bit, post by post, effort stacked on effort. And that's what makes this part of your story untouchable. While they were busy ignoring you, you were planting seeds. You didn't scream for attention. You didn't beg for support. You just kept building, quietly, strategically. The world didn't need to see the grind, because you weren't building for them. You were building for the version of you that once felt invisible, and you gave that version everything it needed. There were no cheat codes, no handouts. You studied for hours, researched, watched others, broke things and rebuilt. You were your own mentor, your own cheerleader, your own editor, producer, strategist. Every step forward was a result of pure will. No shortcuts, just persistence. And through that, you gained something more valuable than attention. You gained resilience. They didn't repost, they didn't comment, but they were watching, silently, waiting to see if you'd fail. And honestly, maybe you wanted them to see. Not to prove anything to them, but to prove something to yourself. That their absence wasn't the end. That you could still rise without them. You became someone they couldn't ignore. not because of their validation, but because of your consistency. That's what changed you. Not success, not going viral, but the process, the lonely process, the repetition, the self-talk, the inner push when the world pulled away. That's what built you. That's what no one can take from you, because it's not a trend, it's not hype, it's discipline, it's character. It's a foundation made out of nights you refused to give up. You had conversations with yourself that no one will ever hear. Talks where you picked yourself off the floor. Talks where you had to remind yourself who you are. That you are not ordinary. That you have something to say. That you are not invisible. You were never invisible. They just weren't looking. But now they do. And even though their eyes are on you now, you're still speaking to yourself first. You'll always speak to yourself first. Because now, your voice is louder than their opinions. You no longer need their permission to post. Their likes don't validate your value. Their applause doesn't measure your worth. You became so grounded in your own voice that even if the crowd goes silent again, you won't flinch. You'll keep creating. You'll keep showing up. Because you remember what it was like to rise with nothing but your own echo. And that echo is enough. At first it was just you. You were doing everything alone. Creating, editing, learning, failing. No recognition, no validation. Not even from the people who claimed to care. They watched you from a distance. Some out of doubt, others out of boredom. You weren't worth the support yet. You weren't impressive enough. And so they stayed quiet, silent while you burned the midnight hours, praying something would work. You weren't asking for praise. You just wanted someone to believe, someone to say, keep going. But no one did. The hardest part wasn't the grind. It wasn't the endless work or the sleepless nights. It was knowing people saw you struggle and chose to say nothing. That silence spoke louder than any insult. You kept trying, even when no one acknowledged your effort. You put content out, and it got ignored. The same people now watching you closely used to scroll past without hesitation. Some muted you, some laughed. They saw the dream, but they didn't see the vision. Then something shifted. Your numbers changed. More followers, more engagement, more results. You could feel the energy change, slowly at first. One by one, familiar names began to appear. Names you hadn't seen in months. People who hadn't messaged you in years suddenly dropped a "so proud of you" comment, and you just stared. Where were they when your content got 3 likes? When your reach was so low you questioned your own voice? Now they follow. They forward your reels. They tag friends. They pretend they were always there. Some even rewrite history. I always said you had it in you. You read it and wonder if they think you forgot. You didn't. You remember the silence. You remember the way your DMs stayed dry when you were pouring your soul into work that no one acknowledged. They weren't blind. They were indifferent. Because success hadn't touched you yet. That's how people are. They don't want to be there during the climb. It's uncomfortable to support someone who's still figuring it out. It's risky. There's no guarantee. And people only bet on what looks promising. You didn't look promising when you were posting shaky videos at 2 a.m., figuring out algorithms, learning lighting, scripting, editing on your phone, and trying to stay sane. You were building something they couldn't see yet, so they stayed silent. But now they show up. They act familiar. They throw words like bro or queen in your comments, like they earn the right to be part of your glow. And maybe part of you still wants to feel good about it. Maybe it feels validating, finally being seen. But there's a bitterness to it, a quiet disappointment that they waited until it was safe to support you. until other people approved, until your following reached a certain size. You notice how your inbox changed. People who used to leave you on red now want collaboration. Those who mocked your ideas now want advice. You reread old conversations, realizing how easily they dismissed your vision. Now they want in. Now they want to be part of something you bled for in silence. But they weren't there during the fall. They weren't holding your hand when you questioned your worth. Support isn't measured by applause when the crowd arrives. It's shown by presence. When there is no crowd, when you're performing on an empty stage and someone still claps. That's the kind of support you remember. And sadly, most people didn't offer that. Now they move like ghosts, suddenly visible, suddenly warm, suddenly invested. But you know better. You see through the timing. You recognize the pattern. They follow success, not effort. They praise the result, not the resilience. They weren't around when you were questioning if any of this would matter, when you thought of quitting, when you doubted your voice, your ideas, your entire path. You don't hate them. You just can't forget. You won't forget who vanished when it was hard, who only showed up when it looked easy. Your climb was long. It was lonely. You made mistakes. You faced losses. You got laughed at. You showed up anyway. You stayed in the fight when no one clapped. And now that you're rising, they act like they never left, like they were always cheering for you. But cheering from the sidelines only counts if you were there when the lights were off. Most of them were not. And it's not about holding grudges. It's about understanding the truth. Some people don't see value until it's proven, and some only attach themselves when you've already won. They wear support like a costume, only when it's trending. But when it wasn't popular to back you, they stayed quiet. Or worse, they watched you fall and said nothing. Now they repost your videos. Now they tell others how they knew you. But they didn't know the nights you cried over your work. They didn't know the anxiety you swallowed while trying to create something from nothing. They weren't in the room when you prayed for one more chance, one more push, one more reason to believe. They weren't part of your growth. They're just reacting to your shine. And it's hard not to feel a little empty when they come around now. It's not the recognition that bothers you. It's how delayed it is. How it only showed up once the noise started. They weren't fans of the silence, but that silence built everything they admire today. You did that, alone. So when they show up now, talking support, talking loyalty, talking admiration, you nod, you smile. But inside, you know the truth. They follow now, but they never helped you rise. They didn't clap when you were building. They didn't comment when your work got 2 likes. They didn't share your content when you poured hours into it. Now they post you. They tag you. They send your clips around like they were always proud. But you remember who watched in silence. You remember who treated your ambition like a phase. Who rolled their eyes when you spoke about your goals. Who nodded but never believed. It stays with you. You remember sending them your early work, that quiet hope you held in your chest when you hit send. Not because you needed validation, but because you wanted to be seen, to be heard, and they saw it, but ignored it. Some didn't even respond. Others gave you one-word answers, half smiles, or awkward silence. You weren't trending, so you weren't valuable yet. That truth cut you in a way that didn't bleed, but it bruised. Now those same people want to be associated with you. They follow you closely. Some even pretend they were there from the start. But you know the difference between a supporter and a spectator. Supporters lift you when no one's watching. Spectators only show up when the crowd forms. And now there's a crowd. Now your name means something, and they act like it always did. They talk about you differently now. Back then it was, "You sure this will work?" Or maybe you should get a backup plan. Now it's, "I always knew you had it." No, they didn't. They didn't repost your struggles. They didn't defend you when others mocked your vision. They didn't stand beside you when the room felt heavy with doubt. They waited, sat in comfort, watched you fight your own demons, your own fear, your own doubt, and said nothing. You remember how hard it was to stay consistent without applause, waking up with no messages, no support, no one asking how it's going. You held your own hand through every breakdown. They see the outcome, but they never carried the process. They want to skip the silence and only show up in the celebration. But the silence is where it was earned. Now your quotes are on their stories, your videos in their group chats. Your voice is being shared by mouths that once stayed shut. It's surreal and a little bitter, not because you didn't want this, but because it confirms what you always feared. People care more when it benefits them, when your name brings them likes, when your brand is their bragging right. They didn't help you rise, but they want to stand next to you now. Take photos, shake hands, post memories that never existed. They're rewriting their version of the story to include them. But you haven't forgotten the truth. You remember every event they skipped, every time you needed someone to hype you up and no one showed. You remember not having a single message of encouragement on days you were thinking of quitting. They want to say they supported you, but support looks different when it's quiet. Support is showing up when no one else does. It's posting your work when you're still unknown. It's sharing your name in rooms without needing anything in return. That didn't happen. And now they act confused when you don't rush to respond, when you keep a polite distance. You're not bitter, you're aware. The truth is, your silence speaks louder now. You don't explain yourself anymore. You don't correct their lies. Let them say what they want. Let them act like they were part of the rise. You're not focused on proving who was there. You're focused on building what's next. But in your heart, there's a wall now, a filter, a knowing. You love differently. You trust slower. Because success didn't just show you who's clapping. It showed you who only claps when the room does. They think a follow now makes up for years of silence. It doesn't. You don't need revenge. You don't need to call anyone out. The growth speaks for itself. Your presence now stings the ones who overlooked you. Not because you changed, but because you no longer look for them. You no longer need their praise. You already made it without it. And that fact hurts them more than anything you could ever say. They're trying to catch up to your story. But they missed the most important chapters. The lonely nights, the unanswered messages, the days you almost gave up, the hours you spent learning, failing, adjusting. They missed the part where you became who you are. And now, they only want the highlight reel. But that's all they'll ever get. You're not cruel. You just remember. Memory has become your guide. It doesn't control you, but it reminds you. Who clapped when there was nothing to gain? Who stood tall for you when there was no spotlight? Those are the names that stay close. Everyone else, they can follow from a distance. You don't need them to be proud now. It's not for them anymore. The rise was never fueled by their cheers. It was built from every ignored message, every fake laugh, every skipped post. You were shaped in silence, forged in neglect. So no, you don't owe them a seat at your table. Watching is enough. Following is enough. Because they didn't help you rise, but now they'll never look away. You never wanted revenge, not the loud kind, Not the kind where you scream into the void, hoping they hear you. You just wanted peace. A chance to live without carrying the weight of being unseen. You weren't chasing approval. You were just tired of being ignored. Tired of trying to prove your worth to people who didn't care to look. They didn't see you, and that silence became your drive. You didn't wake up one day and decide to glow up to hurt them. You woke up because staying in the same place hurt more than starting over. You didn't build yourself to make a point. You built yourself because you were falling apart. You found comfort in progress. You learned to breathe through the grind. You learned to trust your footsteps, even when the ground kept shaking. While they laughed, you were building quietly. While they gossiped, you were sacrificing days, nights, sleep. You missed out on things you'll never get back, and they didn't notice or care. You weren't flashy enough then. You weren't worth watching yet. Your failures were funny to them. Your ambition was naive. They wanted you to fall, not because they hated you, but because they couldn't imagine you rising. You were the underdog they never thought would make it. They spoke your name only to mock it, or worse, never spoke it at all. They watched you struggle and never offered help, not a call, not a message, nothing. You were building a dream from scraps, and they were too busy scrolling. Now they follow everything, every post, every project. They suddenly care. But you remember, that's the difference. You remember when no one believed. You remember when you had to celebrate your wins alone. Small wins. That felt like survival. You remember refreshing your feed, hoping someone saw what you created, hoping someone said, "Keep going." But no one did. You weren't loud enough for their attention. You weren't shiny enough for their praise. So you learned to move in silence, not out of bitterness, but survival. You stopped posting your pain. You stopped hoping for support. You let your work do the speaking. You turned your silence into strategy. You kept showing up, tired, unnoticed, unvalidated, but consistent. And that consistency turned into results, slowly, but real. They started noticing when the numbers grew, when your name got mentioned in spaces they couldn't enter, when your presence became undeniable. That's when they showed up. Suddenly they always knew you had it in you. Now they share your content. Now they ask how you did it. Now they pretend to care about the work you did alone. But your success wasn't built for them. It wasn't born out of spite. It came from pain, from failure, from late nights where you questioned everything, from mornings where you almost quit, from days when your own voice was the only one cheering. They didn't see that part. They just saw the final version. That's why it hurts differently, because now they celebrate the outcome they never helped create. They want to be part of the victory, but not the battle. They want to claim a seat at a table they never helped build. But your success doesn't forget the silence. It doesn't forget the empty rooms, the ignored messages, the lonely milestones. You don't post to impress them. You post because you earned it. You share your wins because no one else did when you were losing. You no longer seek validation. You've outgrown the need to be seen by those who once overlooked you. You've reached a place they never thought you would. Not because you proved them wrong, but because you proved yourself right. The revenge wasn't planned. It happened naturally. You worked, you healed, you didn't complain, you didn't ask for shortcuts. While they waited for you to fall, you learned how to fly. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't perfect, but it was yours. Every inch of progress, yours. Now they follow in silence, watching the growth they never watered. They quote your words. They try to align themselves with your success. But you know the truth. You know who watched you struggle and said nothing. You know who stayed quiet when they could have helped, and now their sudden interest feels hollow. But you don't let it break your focus. You've come too far to be distracted. You're not trying to make them regret it. That's not your goal. Your only goal now is to become everything you knew you could be when no one else believed. Your glow-up isn't revenge. It's the reward for the nights you didn't give up, for the days you kept going without applause. They never helped you rise, but now they follow, and they will keep following, because there's something about watching someone you counted out become untouchable. Your silence became the loudest response. Your progress became the truth they can't argue with. You didn't scream. You didn't fight for their attention. You just outworked everything they thought about you. They don't know what it cost, and they never will, because that pain, that effort, that internal battle, it belonged to you, and only you. You paid in loneliness, in rejection, in failure. And now you stand where they never thought you would. Not because of them, but despite them. That's what real power looks like. Not loud, not flashy, just undeniable, consistent, focused, silent, but strong enough to echo through the same silence they gave you. They follow now, but they never helped you rise. There was a time when no one answered your messages. You'd send updates hoping someone would care, hoping for a response, a reaction, anything. But your phone stayed quiet. Days went by, weeks. You started doubting yourself, not because you weren't working hard, but because the silence made you feel invisible. Now that same phone lights up constantly. Requests, collaborations, shout-outs, mentorships, from names that once scrolled past you without hesitation. You walk into rooms now, and people know who you are. They don't say it out loud, but their eyes change. The way they shake your hand, the way they mention your name in passing, it's all different. They say they've been following you for years. You nod. You don't correct them, but you remember. You remember who reposted your wins and who stayed silent when you were gasping for recognition. Now people send you voice notes praising your grind. They speak about inspiration as if they were beside you in the struggle, but they weren't. You were alone. There were nights when the only sound was a hum of your laptop. You stayed up editing while others slept peacefully. You didn't even know if it would pay off. You just kept going, not for applause, not for attention, but because something inside wouldn't let you quit. It's strange. People once mocked you for taking it seriously. They'd laugh when you mentioned your goals, say things like, "That's cute," or "maybe one day." Now they say you're lucky. They act like you woke up and everything just worked out. They don't talk about the rejection emails, the failed launches, the unread pitches. They don't mention the burnout, the anxiety, the second guessing. They only see the end product and pretend they always believed. The same people who doubted your ideas now want to use them. They want strategy, guidance, access. You hear phrases like, "Bro, let's build together," or "put me on." It's always about what you can give now, not what you've been through. And it's not bitterness that fills you, it's clarity. You smile, not because you need their approval now, but because you understand your worth in a way you didn't before. You're sitting at tables you used to dream about. Back then, it was a fantasy. You'd scroll through posts of creators living the life you wanted, wondering if you'd ever get there. Now you're not just in the room, you're part of the conversation. People ask for your opinion. They want your take. And it feels surreal. Not because of fame, but because you remember being on the outside, looking in, just hoping to be seen. What they don't realize is that you paid for that seat in ways they'll never understand. Not just in hours, not just in discipline, but in disappointment. In nights you almost quit, in friendships you outgrew, in people who left when you was no longer convenient. That seat cost everything, and now that you have it, you protect it. You don't just give access to anyone. You've learned the hard way that not everyone clapping for you wants to see you win. They ask for just 5 minutes. But they didn't have 5 seconds when you were crying quietly, wondering if you should just stop. They didn't reply when you said, "Hey, check this out." But now they want to be featured. They want credit. They want to feel like they were part of the story. But they weren't. They watched the movie halfway through and claimed they knew the plot all along. You never wanted fame. You wanted freedom. You wanted to feel like your work mattered, that your name meant something. Now it does. Not because they said so, but because you didn't wait for their validation. You built when no one was looking. And now that the lights are on, they squint to recognize the version of you that survived everything. Sometimes you scroll back to your old posts, the ones with 2 likes, the ones that felt pointless at the time. But you kept posting. You kept showing up, even when it felt humiliating. That consistency built this moment. Not trends, not luck, just grit. And now the numbers they used to laugh at are the same ones they study. They try to reverse engineer your process. But it wasn't just strategy. It was stubborn belief, a refusal to fade away. They use your name in rooms where they never invited you before. They tell others they knew you before it all happened. But you remember they didn't. Not really. They knew of you, but they didn't see you. And now that you're visible, they want credit. They want to skip the hard part and land where you are. But what they don't get is you are where you are because you never skipped the hard part. You say no more often now, not because you're arrogant, but because you understand what it took to get here. Your time is sacred. Your effort has value. You're no longer accessible to everyone. That doesn't make you selfish. That makes you focused. They'll call it changed behavior, but this is who you were becoming the entire time. They just didn't notice when it wasn't benefiting them. They speak differently now. They flatter you, call you talented, say things they never said when it mattered. But words now are currency, and yours are worth something. You don't spend them freely anymore. You speak when it counts. You move with intention, and you don't wait for permission to take up space. You made it into rooms you weren't invited to, and now you build tables of your own, not for clout, but for those who truly showed up, the ones who saw you when no one else did. You haven't forgotten them, because they were rare and real. They didn't need numbers to support you. They believed in your silence, and now their loyalty is gold. You don't need everyone to follow you. You just needed to rise. And now that you have, they can watch, but they'll never know how heavy the climb really was. You don't hold hate. You've grown past that. Hate takes too much energy, and you've learned to protect your peace more than anything else. But just because you don't hate them doesn't mean you forgot. You didn't erase the silence they offered when your world was falling apart. You didn't erase the way they looked through you when you had nothing but potential. Potential doesn't impress people. Results do. And they only showed up once you had something to show. You remember the way your messages were ignored, the way your posts were seen but never acknowledged, the way they rolled their eyes when you spoke about your goals. They said you were too ambitious, too unrealistic. They said it behind your back, thinking it wouldn't reach you. But it did, and it stayed. Not as pain anymore, but as a quiet reminder. A reminder that some people only see your worth when it benefits them. You forgave them, not because they asked for it. Most never did. You forgave them because carrying that weight would have slowed you down. You were too focused on becoming better to keep dragging old disappointments behind you. But you never made the mistake of trusting them again. That's the difference. You learned slowly, painfully. You learned that not everyone is meant to stay. That support isn't something you beg for. It's either there or it isn't. People love a success story, especially when they can pretend they were part of it. They'll repost your wins, celebrate your glow up, say proud of you, like they were in the trenches with you. But they weren't. You were alone. You faced your demons without applause. You worked in silence, cried behind locked doors, kept going when quitting would have made more sense. They weren't there then, and that matters. It's easy to clap now. It's easy to say, "I knew you'd make it," when everything looks polished. But you remember who helped push you forward and who just watched from the sidelines. Watching isn't supporting. Views aren't presence. Likes aren't loyalty. You can feel the difference. You always could. But back then, you kept hoping people would show up. You kept giving chances. You excused the distance. You told yourself they were busy, unaware, maybe even shy. But that was just you trying to protect the idea of them. The reality was clearer. They didn't believe in you when it counted, and that stung. Now when they come around, it feels different. Their words feel hollow. Their compliments come too late. You smile, you nod, but inside, you know. You know who checked on you when you vanished, who asked how you were doing when nothing was going right, who reposted your early work even when it had no views, who stayed when there was no benefit to staying. Those are the ones you protect. The rest, you keep at a distance. It's not pettiness, it's protection. You've seen how quick people are to shift, how quick they attach themselves to your wins, but disappeared when you needed backup. So now you move differently. You're polite, cordial, but not open, not vulnerable, because that openness got you hurt before. And you don't bleed in public anymore. There's power in that clarity, in knowing who's real. It's not about grudges, it's about patterns. You started noticing how people only check in when something goes viral, how they mention your name when it fits their narrative, how they act like they've always supported you when you remember the silence, the forgotten invitations, the ignored messages, the skipped opportunities. You don't bring it up, you don't confront them. That would imply you still care. But you don't, not in the same way. You care in the way someone cares about an old scar. It's there. It healed, but you never forget what caused it. That's how you move now, calm, composed, but aware. You trust people to be exactly who they showed you they are, and you don't expect anything more. They say success changes people, but often it just reveals the truth about you, and the truth about them. You didn't change, you just stopped shrinking. You stopped tolerating half-hearted support. You stopped waiting, and that unsettled them, because they were used to the version of you that was always available, always understanding, always hopeful. That version had to go. Now, you remember from a place of strength. You look back not to stay there, but to honor the version of you that kept pushing. The one who stood through all the silence. The one who was counted out and kept going anyway. That version of you didn't need their approval, and neither does the version standing here now. Some of them might say you're different. You are. You don't entertain fake love anymore. You don't smile through disrespect. You protect your energy like your life depends on it, because it does. You spent too long giving it away to people who didn't value it. That time is over. You can forgive someone and never let them close again. You can wish them well and never speak again. You don't owe anyone access just because they knew the old you, especially when the old you had to suffer to become who you are now. So you let them follow, let them repost, let them pretend, but you never forget, not out of bitterness, but because the lessons were earned, paid in tears, effort, and nights no one saw. You owe it to yourself to remember what it cost to stand here, and who was never willing to help you rise. They never believed, not really, not when it mattered. When the vision was blurry and your voice cracked trying to explain it, they smiled with polite disinterest. Some changed the subject, some laughed, others just nodded, like they were doing you a favor by listening. You saw the disconnection in their eyes, the same eyes that now watch your every move. They're following you now, sharing your words, quoting your lines. But back then, when everything was uncertain, they didn't clap. You remember showing them your early work, the videos, the sketches, the drafts. You remember the silence, that long pause after you shared something you put your soul into. That uncomfortable space where they didn't know what to say because they didn't take you seriously. They didn't see what you saw. You weren't asking for applause. You were just hoping for presence. Just one voice saying, "Keep going." Instead, you were met with shrugs, smirks, or worse, nothing. Some of them were friends, people you trusted, people who said they believed in you, but disappeared when things got hard. You reached out, hoping to collaborate, to connect, to simply feel less alone in the pursuit. They said they were busy, they forgot, they didn't follow through. But now, they send messages like, "I always knew you had it in you." They didn't, and you don't hate them for it, but you remember. They weren't there during the late nights when you worked with shaky hands and burning eyes, when you were building in silence, doubting every step but still refusing to quit. You needed encouragement, not validation, not hype, just something human. But they withheld even that. Some watched from the shadows. They saw your effort, but didn't acknowledge it, not even a word. Now those same people have notifications on for your posts. It's a strange feeling, seeing their names pop up now. The same names that left you on red, that ignored your invites, that skipped your launch. They didn't clap when you had 5 followers, when your content got no traction, when you failed publicly. They were silent spectators. And now they act like they were part of the process. They write comments filled with nostalgia, as if they supported the climb, as if they were present when you were fighting through self-doubt. You didn't resent them. You just stopped expecting them to care. That decision changed everything. You built without applause. You created without feedback. You kept showing up when no one else did. And now, your consistency is undeniable. Your growth is visible, and they want to be near it, because now it's easy to support. Now it looks successful. Now it's trending. You became convenient. Some of them post your achievements to look supportive, to gain social credit. They caption it with "proud of you" or "always knew you'd win." But you know the truth. They were quiet during the storm. They speak now because the sun's out. They weren't lifting you. They were watching to see if you'd fall. And when you didn't, when you rose, they followed. They think following now covers the silence back then. But silence leaves stains. You learn something painful. People don't support potential. They support results. They don't stand by you during the climb. They wait at the top, ready to smile in photos, ready to say they were part of it. They don't ask about the sacrifices, the anxiety, the burnout. They only see the shine, never the scars. But you see everything. You remember who helped, who called, who showed up. That list is short and sacred. It's not that you didn't have support. You had a few real ones, maybe one, maybe just yourself, and that was enough. You learned to be your own cheerleader, your own motivator, your own proof. That's why their current praise means so little. Not out of ego, out of truth. Because if you would have stopped back then, they wouldn't have noticed. If you failed quietly, they wouldn't have mentioned your name again. Your success didn't just surprise them, it bothered them. Now they mimic your style, they quote your pain, they reference your discipline, they act like they studied your process. But they didn't. They just saw the glow and wanted a reflection. You don't need their praise. You've outgrown it. You've grown beyond needing to be validated by people who couldn't see you at your worst. They follow now because they want a piece of the light. But you had to find that light in total darkness. There's no bitterness in your heart, just awareness. You see people clearly now. You're not angry they didn't help you rise. You're just not fooled by their sudden loyalty. Your success isn't a thank you card for them. It's a silent nod to your past self. The one who stayed up late, who didn't quit, who believed, even when belief felt foolish. You don't create for their likes. You create because you have something to say, something they can't silence anymore. They think showing up now makes them part of the story. But you already wrote the chapters where they went missing. You didn't erase them. You just stopped depending on them. Let them follow. Let them repost. Let them act proud. You see the difference now between those who were there and those who appear when it's safe. You're not bitter. You're not cold. You're just done pretending they were part of the rise. They weren't. Let them watch. Let them clap now. Let them pretend they saw it coming. You know who stayed when nothing was certain, and you'll never forget who watched in silence while you learned how to fly.